I am Tony Stewart, and I am grateful to have the opportunity to introduce today's speaker and to conclude the Convocation series. Before doing so, I think it is just most important that the special people in this audience take this opportunity while you have it to thank some very special people. I would like to call the name of all the members of the Convocations Committee, and I would like to ask you to stand, and I would ask those in the audience to join me. If you, like I, believe that this has been a very important and informative week, let's give our thank you to the Convocations Committee. First of all is Niels Rosedal. Would you please stand? Joe Jonas, Tim Rarick, and the chair of the Convocations Committee, a big hand, she's worked so hard, Jean Ann Mitchell. Ladies and gentlemen, as we close our Convocation series, we have a very special closing speech. Occasionally in life, one has the opportunity to meet someone that you instantly realize is very special. And when I met this person by phone some weeks ago, I knew that I had met that kind of person. She is deeply caring, she is totally committed, and I was a very lucky person that our two ships passed in the night, and I hope that we see one another again. Our speaker today is Susan Sheehan. She is a staff writer and has been in that position since 1962 for The New Yorker. And she is also a publisher of books and was the winner of that very prestigious award in 1983, the Pulitzer Prize for Nonfiction, for her book entitled, Is There No Place on Earth for Me? Her other books that have been published are 10 Vietnamese, A Welfare Mother, A Prison and a Prisoner, Kate Quinton's Days, and A Missing Plane. Our speaker has also received the very prestigious National Mental Health Association Award, along with many other awards, including the New York Press Club Feature Writing Award in 1984 and the American Bar Association Silver Gavel Award in 1978. And like one of our other speakers, she has got to where she is in her writing by actually being out there. I guess I am so touched by her because she said to me, I don't spend my time with the rich and the famous for my writing, but I spend my time with people who have been in mental institutions. She spent about 1.5 years off and on in the home of a welfare mother, and that's why she can say what she says to you today. Let's give a great Idaho welcome to a very special person, Susan Sheehan.
Thank you very much. It's nice to be in Coeur d'Alene today, and I thank Tony Stewart for inviting me to be here. This is the first time I've been in this beautiful state in over 30 years. I spent my 3 summers between college years waiting on tables at Sun Valley, and those were 3 of the happiest, most carefree times of my life. I must admit that I originally turned down this invitation, despite the scenery and the happy memories, for 2 reasons. First, it did seem a long way to go for a talk. My husband and I live in the other Washington, the District of Columbia, and I'm not accustomed to crossing the continent on Thursday and again on Friday. Second, I was sent a program of the convocations being held on the subject Beyond Darkness between February 6th and 9th, and told that my assignment was to wrap up all the sessions. But, I stammered to Tony, how on earth do you sum up the subjects of destructive competition, incest, release from the Soviet Union, street people, the social impact of television, and the liberation of a World War II concentration camp, with or without in my case, ever having heard one of the previous speakers? You don't, Tony Stewart replied. You've written 6 books about people who are unfortunate, so you just get on the plane and tell us about them after you land. I hope that Tony Stewart will have no regrets at the end of this non-wrap-up. 6 books, that's getting ahead of myself, so I'll start at the beginning, a very good place to start. I wanted to be a writer ever since I was 10 years old and was assigned that great classic composition, A Day in the Life of a Penny. Perhaps you remember it. The penny begins the day in the pocketbook of Mrs. Smith, who gives it to the butcher when paying for a leg of lamb. The butcher passes the penny on to the newsstand dealer when he buys his paper, and so on and on. This 10-year-old fifth grader had a child get her hands on the penny and spend it on candy. I didn't do much about becoming a writer for the next 11 years. I didn't even major in English at college. English majors terrified me. They wore black stockings, the bohemian fashion of the day. I wore saddle shoes and socks. They smoked. I've always been allergic to cigarettes. They could understand Milton's Areopagitica. I couldn't even spell it. Almost as soon as I graduated from college, however, I went about becoming a writer. In January 1959, I got a job in New York City, where I grew up, as a fact checker on Esquire. It was then a more serious magazine than it is today. My job was to check all the facts and articles ready to go to press. If a writer had written the sentence, "Mr. and Mrs. Jones live in the village of Scarsdale," Scarsdale is a suburb of New York City, I checked the spelling of Jones, the spelling of Scarsdale, whether the Joneses lived there, and whether Scarsdale was a village or an incorporated township. There was no better training for a prospective writer. Once you've learned how to verify facts, you have a good idea of how to go out and get them. In September 1960, I quit my job. I'd worked nights and weekends, had sold some articles, had a couple of assignments, and could afford to risk giving up my $60 a week salary and still keep my $100 a month apartment. In December 1960, I sold my first piece to The New Yorker. It was my favorite magazine then, just as it is now, and I've been a staff writer for The New Yorker, as Tony said, since 1962, which in some days seems like yesterday. It's over a quarter of a century that has gone too fast and ended too soon, and at other times, like today, seems forever, because I realize that very many of you had not been born in 1962. As a young writer, I did book reviews, theater reviews, humor pieces, and short stories, but my bent was nonfiction. In the early 60s, I was among the contributors to our Talk of the Town section. That's the first section of the magazine, the one with 3 or 4 short unsigned pieces that begin, "Last Monday we went to a cocktail party," or "Last Tuesday we went to the botanical garden." I adjusted to the first person plural by thinking of we as me and my tapeworm. My tapeworm and I weren't inspired by the cocktail parties or botanical gardens, probably a matter of temperament. I have a colleague, Brendan Gill, who attends 2 or 3 cocktail parties almost every evening, and another colleague, the late Jeffrey Hellman, wrote 100 talk stories about botanical gardens. Tapeworm and I wanted to have adventures like that penny. For one Talk of the Town story, I climbed to the top of the Rockefeller Center Christmas tree. If you ever have occasion to be so foolhardy, my advice is not to look down. Just enjoy the unprecedented view of Saks Fifth Avenue across the street. For another talk story, I followed a letter mailed one evening in Midtown New York City through the postal system until it reached its downtown New York City destination the following morning. With the decline of the postal service, that story would be exceedingly unpleasant to attempt today. Instead of staying up all one night to complete it, you'd be up 2 or 3 nights. By 1963, I was writing longer signed pieces, again a matter of temperament. I preferred writing on fewer subjects in greater depth. My first series of articles on the crime of burglary was published in December 1963. In March '65, I flew to Indonesia to marry a New York Times correspondent I'd met in New York a few months earlier. In August '65, it was out of the frying pan and into the fire. Neil was transferred to the New York Times Saigon Bureau, where I wrote my first book, 10 Vietnamese. The fire proved sadder, but far more interesting than the frying pan, and I feel privileged to have seen it firsthand, the most significant event of my generation. We returned to Washington, D.C. in '66, when Neil was assigned there, and have lived in the nation's capital ever since. Our 2 daughters were born in 1967 and 1969, and while they were very young, I primarily wrote Talk of the Town stories and so-called magaziners for magazines like McCall's and the New York Times. I was assigned to do profiles of a number of well-known people: Ethel Kennedy, Jacqueline Onassis, Roosevelt Longworth, who was Teddy Roosevelt's daughter, the Buckley women, the mother and sisters of William Buckley, Edmund Muskie when he was front runner for the Democratic presidential nomination in 1970, Jack Anderson, and Robert Redford. Riding around San Francisco for 2 weeks on a motorcycle with Robert Redford, he was out there to make a movie, is not exactly a hardship. His eyes are very blue. He is very personable. His acting is effortless. But celebrity profiles are not very substantial. After uncovering the fact that Jackie Onassis always bought a dozen T-shirts or sweater when she went shopping instead of one of each, and that Ethel Kennedy took $300 sets of French sheets to the hospital when she gave birth to every one of her 11 children, and that she left her children, and not just her sheets, in the custody of a large staff of servants, I found myself asking, who cares? The answer was obvious. Readers cared. My profiles of Ethel and Jackie made me an authority of sorts on the Kennedy women and led to countless requests from magazine editors to write a profile of Joan Kennedy. I turned down the offers with a 3 strikes and you're out sort of feeling. I wish sometimes I had cared. There's real money to be made in writing about the foibles of the well-to-do. Among our popular television shows are Dynasty, Dallas, Falcon Crest, about the fictitious rich, and a show called Lifestyles of the Rich and Famous, which one TV critic has aptly described as the ultimate in generically titled programming. You will find little on the bestseller list except books on how to get thin and how to get rich, and books on or about celebrities. Recent bestsellers by Lee Iacocca, George Burns, and Shirley Temple come quickly to mind. People magazine's circulation is in the millions. The New Yorker is a mere 600,000. The television day begins with the Today Show, on which actors, rock stars, and other movers and shakers are to be seen, and ends with more of the same on The Tonight Show. Brendan Gill, the cocktail party goer, who is one of my favorite New Yorker colleagues, once wrote a novel in which his central character said, "I've always been so ready to be rich." Years later, in a book of nonfiction, Brendan wrote, when the character said that, he was speaking from the author's heart. I guess it would be nice to be free of financial worries. Maria Sheehan is just out of college, and Catherine Sheehan is a college sophomore, and there have been days when tuition payments were due that I would dearly love to have had Lee Iacocca's royalties. And yet, life is short. Too short, it seemed to me, back in 1972, when Catherine was in nursery school and Maria in kindergarten, and my attention span to increase as theirs did, to spend on work that didn't seem worthwhile. That year, when I reflected on the writing I'd done that meant the most to me, it was 10 Vietnamese. In that slender volume, I told the stories of 10 Vietnamese people, a peasant, a refugee, an orphan, a South Vietnamese army private, a North Vietnamese prisoner, and others. There were people who didn't speak English, didn't plot coups or command troops, and didn't hold press conferences, and who were therefore ignored by the American press, for whom, with the ever-increasing American involvement in the war, Vietnam had become an American rather than a Vietnamese story. It was these Vietnamese, the people I had heard called the 95% who don't count, who interested me, because the war was being fought over them, and they were its chief participants and chief victims. I certainly learned more from them than I would have had I listened to the South Vietnamese or American generals who left their reputations in the rice paddies and wasted the lives of thousands of men, women, and children. I know I always had a better time in peasant huts than at embassy briefings, and heard more truth spoken by the peasants than by the civilian and military spokesmen. I remember the afternoon a spokesman told us, with a straight face, that a recent study had shown that bombing peasants was a good thing, because the peasants wouldn't blame the Americans who were bombing them, they would blame the Vietnamese communists. To me, it was arrant nonsense. People blame those who are bombing them, not someone else. When I was shot at, I knew exactly whom to blame. So did the Vietnamese peasants I met. When it came time for me to start another book in 1973, the subject I chose was welfare, perhaps because welfare mothers didn't count for much in our society. I knew little about welfare except cliches. I'd heard the then popular song Welfare Cadillac and statements such as, women on welfare have more children only to get more welfare. I have a skeptical nature. I wanted to see if the cliches were true. I doubted that they were, because they seemed to be circulated by people who had probably never gotten to know anyone on welfare, people like me. My last 4 books, starting with The Welfare Mother, have appeared in The New Yorker before they had been put between hardcovers. So the first thing I did after conjuring up a subject was to ask William Sheehan, the magazine's editor for 35 years until his retirement 2 years ago, if I might write about it. For all I knew, another staff writer had already been working on a similar article for 6 months. William Sheehan, more than any other editor I've met, knows his own mind. When you ask, "Welfare Mother, Mr. Sheehan?" he usually answers yes or no. If he says yes, he doesn't ask questions. He seems to know that you will not choose to write about an ailing, lonely, middle-aged, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant widow who is on welfare, if, as happens to be the case in New York City, the majority of those on welfare are Puerto Rican women who have children and who live with men without benefit of holy matrimony. If Mr. Sheehan says no, there's no point in wasting another word on your brilliant idea. When he says no, he means no for all eternity. If he says yes, you disappear, and if you're lucky, as I was in this instance, you return a year and a half later with a 30,000-word article. This may be an appropriate time to tell you that New Yorker staff writers are not on salary, so we are at liberty to take as long as we like on stories, to go as broke as we choose, at no cost to the magazine. Nothing has changed under Sheehan's fine successor, Robert Gottlieb, including our financial situation. The first 3 months I spent on The Welfare Mother, January to March of 1973, were not auspicious. I had assumed I would find a subject within a week. There were, after all, tens of thousands of Puerto Rican welfare mothers in the city. Despite a network of helpful friends, my search for a subject took 3 months. The mayor's policy assistant on such matters as welfare, workers at health clinics, settlement house directors in Puerto Rican neighborhoods, Puerto Rican politicians, and priests with parishes in various Puerto Rican sections of the city tried to find a Puerto Rican welfare mother who would talk to me, but they weren't close enough to their constituencies or flocks to be able to persuade any member of them to confide in me. A useful lesson, but one that didn't bring me closer to a subject. By March, it was even more obvious to me than it had previously been why so many magazine articles and books were written about politicians, movie stars, sports figures, and other publicity seekers. Had I begun a profile of, say, a United States senator or a National Football League quarterback in January, it might already have been completed. I think I kept looking for a Puerto Rican welfare mother because of my personal aversion to writing about people who employ press secretaries or public relations representatives, that is, people who want to be written about, partly because I had a deep interest in Puerto Ricans as a result of having read and admired Oscar Lewis's books and of having done a couple of talks of the town stories on the city's Puerto Rican subculture, and also a reporter's pride, because the prospect of having to tell William Sheehan that I couldn't find a single Puerto Rican welfare mother to talk to in all of New York was simply too embarrassing. Suddenly my luck improved. A friend's husband was about to resign from the Department of Social Services and move west, suggested I phone one of his colleagues, a caseworker I call in the book Louis Steiner. At that time, Louis Steiner was spending most of his time at a desk in a welfare center, but from 1965 until 1971, he had made countless home visits to welfare clients on Manhattan's Lower East Side. He had known a number of welfare mothers well. I found him extremely knowledgeable about them and sympathetic toward them, and talked him introducing me to a welfare mother of his acquaintance. Louis and I made an appointment to see the woman I called Carmen Santana in my book on March 23, 1973. She was clearly happy to see Louis, who had been nice to her when he was her caseworker, and she seemed happy to see me. Louis told Mrs. Santana that I was a writer and wanted to write the story of her life. She nodded nonchalantly, as if she were accustomed to meeting such writers every day of the week. I liked her at once and enjoyed the lively domestic scene that swirled about her. I scrawled a few impressions in my notebook. One of them was men's clothes hanging on pegs in her bedroom. As Louie and I were leaving, I made an appointment to see Mrs. Santana on my own one morning the following week. When I showed up, I found her at home alone. Again, she seemed happy enough to see me. I asked her about her grandparents, her parents, and her childhood in Puerto Rico, which she seemed content to discuss. It is a writer's good fortune that most people enjoy talking about themselves, especially those who rarely have an occasion to do so. At noon, we watched a Spanish-language soap opera on TV, then talked some more about Mrs. Santana's early years in Puerto Rico. When her 4 youngest children came home from school, they also made me feel welcome. By 3:15, I was longing for a cup of coffee and gave the children money to go out and buy a paper container of coffee for me and soda for themselves. I left a little later after making another morning appointment to see Mrs. Santana. I decided that Mrs. Santana wouldn't take it amiss if I brought the makings of lunch for the 2 of us, so I arrived for our second interview with a loaf of French bread, some butter, and assorted cold cuts. I was very glad I had. Although Mrs. Santana is not much of a coffee drinker herself, she had seen how grateful I had been for the coffee in my previous visit and had bought half a pound of good Puerto Rican coffee and a quart of milk especially for me. That day we talked about Vicente Santana, the next to last of Mrs. Santana's non-husbands and the father of her 4 youngest children. She talked about his womanizing with a great glee. Our 4th or 5th meeting happened to occur on a welfare check day in April. I asked Mrs. Santana how much her check was for. She showed it to me. I asked if she could manage on what I took to be the grant for 5 people, herself and the 4 youngest of her 9 children. She told me she was receiving the grant for 7 people. An older daughter and that daughter's baby had lived with her briefly the previous year and had legally been on her case. They had returned to Puerto Rico some months earlier. She hadn't had them taken off her case, she said, and asked me if I thought she should. One of the occupational hazards of being a reporter is affecting by one's mere presence the events one is there only to record. I said it was none of my business. I think Mrs. Santana trusted me pretty well from the outset. She has a very trusting nature. I know that when several more weeks went by and the grant for seven kept coming, she decided she could tell me anything without suffering adverse consequences. One day in late May, as I was inquiring how she budgeted the grant for 7, she told me about Francisco Delgado, her current live-in boyfriend, and his financial contribution to her household. Each time I went to see Mrs. Santana, I had left her apartment by 4 o'clock. For one thing, she hadn't yet volunteered to tell me about the owner of those men's clothes on the bedroom pegs. For another, I figured it was safer for me to make my way past the drug dealers and junkies in her neighborhood in broad daylight. That afternoon, she invited me to stay for dinner. I tried to decline. "What's the matter, Susan? You got something against eating pig's ears?" one of the kids said. That was no invitation. That was a challenge, and it had to be accepted. I stayed. When Francisco Delgado came home from work at 5 o'clock, it was obvious that he knew who I was. He, too, was friendly and didn't appear threatened by my knowledge of his domestic arrangements. Slowly but surely, I began to spend more time with Mrs. Santana and her family. I was often at her apartment until 3 or 4 in the morning. As I became a more familiar figure in the neighborhood, people seemed not only to accept me, but to watch out for my safety. After seeing a great deal of Mrs. Santana for half a year, I knew her a lot longer and better than anyone I'd ever written about in the past. But I felt that a book about her would benefit from being researched over an even longer period, and was fortunate to be able enough to arrange my schedule so I could write several conventional short articles while continuing to see Mrs. Santana and her family. There were so many people to be interviewed in her family in so many places. One of her older sons was a heroin dealer and wound up in a hospital for 6 weeks after sampling heroin and getting an infection from the needle he had used. The heroin dealer confined to a hospital bed will give you much more time than a heroin dealer on the street. When Mrs. Santana suddenly decided to go to her hometown in Puerto Rico, I flew there with her youngest son, and Maria Sheehan, then 6 years old. We stayed at the ramshackle house of one of Mrs. Santana's aunts, 5 to a room. The aunt slept in a single bed. The 2 kids slept in sleeping bags on the floor, and Mrs. Santana and I occupied a double bed. I never expected to share a bed with a subject, but a writer's life is full of surprises, some of them pleasant, others less so. Among Mrs. Santana's virtues as a subject, from my point of view, was honesty. She was always truthful to me, if not to the Department of Social Services. When a friend of Louis Steiner's lent me Mrs. Santana's case record to read, I learned that everything she had told me that was capable of being confirmed by the written record was indeed confirmed by it. Celebrities lie a lot to reporters about the silliest things. During the 1984 presidential campaign, Gary Hart had to admit he had shaved a year off his age. His credibility and problems increased 4 years later. And Nancy Reagan left the White House refusing to acknowledge that her real date of birth is 1921 and not 1923. Another of Mrs. Santana's virtues as a subject is that she never regarded any of my questions as an invasion of her privacy. On the contrary, she always led me to believe that she preferred my most outrageous personal questions, those about her love life, for instance, to my questions about her ancestors, who held rather little interest for her. You couldn't get Mrs. Onassis to speak about her father, Black Jack Bouvier, even if you found him more interesting than President Kennedy's philandering, as I did. Imagine what it's like to have a dashing-looking father whom you love more than your mother, but who, when you're about to be married to Senator Kennedy in Newport, Rhode Island, travels to Newport to give you away, gets drunk, and never gets to the church for the wedding. Imagining and interviewing Jackie's friends is all you can do, as she generally declines to speak to the press. A word about friends of celebrities. It is not pleasant to interview those who bask in the reflected glow of celebrity friendships. They tend to be fawning courtiers and gophers. Mrs. Santana's eagerness to see me was another felicitous trait from my point of view. Robert Redford is a polite man, but it is obvious that he suffers reporters ungladly, and only when he has a new movie to peddle. Like many other public figures, he is wary and has been over-interviewed. Mrs. Santana had never been interrogated or observed by a writer. Observing, I should say, is frequently more fruitful than interrogation, and she had nothing to gain from talking to me, which was also refreshing. Perhaps to state the situation more accurately, we each had something to gain, a friend from a world that was different from our own. I tried to give as good as I got. Mrs. Santana broadened my culinary horizons with assorted pig parts and octopus. I was the first to introduce yogurt and cottage cheese into her life. A year and a half after I first met Mrs. Santana, I wrote about her. My magazine article appeared in 1975, the book in 1976. After the New Yorker version of The Welfare Mother was published, the magazine's readers wrote me hundreds of letters asking how I knew this, that, and the other fact. A sociologist reader asked about my methodology and technology. A less sociologically oriented reader asked about what he called my bag of tricks. I liked the idea of possessing tricks and let them out of the bag in an afterword I wrote for the book version. Quite simply, the best tricks in my bag are being there, whether at a hospital bedside in New York or in a double bed in Puerto Rico. And time. If you're where you belong in a story and stay there long enough, you'll know enough to do the story justice and to find out the answers to your questions. I found the answer to the question that sent me down the road to writing a welfare in the course of my research. May it please you to know that women like Mrs. Santana don't have more children to get more welfare. If it pleases you to know anything else about that book or what has become of Mrs. Santana since 1976, I'll gladly tell you in the question period. When you step into someone else's life for as long a sojourn as I do, you don't step out just because you've typed the end on the book's last page. The next topic I wanted to write about was a men's maximum security prison. I suspect I'd been wondering where the burglars I had written about in 1963 went after they were arrested and convicted. When I set off to write about welfare, I didn't go through bureaucratic channels because I'd read and heard a great deal about welfare cheating, and if I encountered it, as I rightly guessed I would, I didn't want New York City's Department of Social Services knowing my subject's identity. A reporter's job is to chronicle life on welfare and to protect those who reveal what it is like. Some of us include the First Amendment in our nightly prayers. One can't get into a state institution without going through the bureaucracy. So for the prison book, I wrote to Albany, the capital of New York, and the residence of a goodly number of the state's bureaucrats to obtain permission to spend a year or two in a state prison. Albany is good to the New Yorker. I've always attributed its benevolence to the fact that the bureaucrats don't often read the magazine, and to the fact that we rarely make troublesome headlines the way daily newspapers do. The people in Albany are so accustomed to daily journalists that they soon forget about yearly and every other yearly journalists, so you can usually find out what's happening wherever you land, especially after the first several months, which must sometimes be invested into blending into the local flora and fauna. It's not as easy to blend into a men's maximum security prison when you're a woman as it is to blend into some other places, and one shouldn't expect to receive a cordial reception from the prison officials who tend to assume you've come to write yet another story about innocent prisoners kept in confinement by sadistic guards. An open-minded prison official, however, let me select a subject, a robber who'd spent 36 out of his past 39 years behind bars on my first day at Greenhaven State Prison. So, unlike Mrs. Santana, my robber, the man I called George Molino, was easy to come by. Finding a place to interview him was my first challenge. There were only a couple of cells at Greenhaven that were private and guarded, and they were in short supply. They were generally reserved as meeting spots for inmates and their lawyers. Mr. Molino and I met several times in the private cells. We got along well, and I sensed that he would not attack me in prison. If I were a customer in a bank or a supermarket he was holding up between prison sentences, that would be a different matter. When we discussed his life and prison conditions as they had evolved during his going on 4 decades of doing time, he didn't seem reticent, so I just suggested to the prison's deputy superintendent of security that I interview him not in a scarce private cell, but in a corner of the guards' room, the room where the guards come to line up at the beginning of their 8-hour shifts and where they often hang out. There was an outlet for my tape recorder in a corner of the room. I didn't trust tape recorders, much less batteries, back in the 70s. An ample opportunity for the guards to eavesdrop. In a few weeks, the guards seemed to have satisfied themselves that I was there to tell a story, but not necessarily a one-sided story. Many prisoners had jobs cleaning the guards' room. They had equal opportunity to eavesdrop and got a sense of what I was doing. After a month, I asked permission to interview George Molino and other inmates who were willing to talk to me on their cell blocks. My friend, the Dep for Security, said yes. He knew the prisoners ran the prison. The guards are unarmed. If they had carried guns, the guns could be taken away from them and used against them by the prisoners, who greatly outnumber them. He also knew that I had figured out which particular prisoners ran the prisons and that they would keep young punks away from me and keep me alive. At Greenhaven, when I was there in 1976 and 1977, the white prisoners were kept in line by members of the mafia, and the black prisoners were kept in line by 2 groups of black Muslims. They seemed to feel that if I were assaulted, it would have reflected adversely on their prison management skills. I've never felt safer in my life than I did at Greenhaven, sitting in a cell block with a dozen convicted murderers, robbers, burglars, and drug dealers. Much safer than I have before or since when riding the New York City subway system. For a couple of months, I was allowed to spend only the 8 a.m. to 4 p.m. day shift at Greenhaven, but eventually I was permitted to work the 4 p.m. to midnight shift, and I occasionally did 24 hours straight to get the feeling of the prison at night. I think the book surprised the inmates and guards who read it because it had no axe to grind. Grinding axes isn't my style. I wrote about what I had learned. Most of those locked up, probably over 99%, were guilty. I learned that it is more difficult to get into a maximum security prison than it is to get into Harvard or North Idaho College. Before you are accepted, unless you're the rare first-time offender who hit his wife, his girlfriend, or his mother-in-law a little harder than you intended and unintentionally killed her instead of just giving her a good beating in a family squabble, you almost first commit multiple crimes as a juvenile offender, put in some time at reform schools, graduate to adult crimes for which you receive probation and a few suspended sentences before you go to jail, and then, after some more crimes, go to a minimum security prison and to a medium security prison, and only then, many crimes later, to a maximum security prison where it costs the state $30,000 a year to keep you in a cell with little to do. Even cleaning jobs that pay a couple of dollars and may kill 2 hours a day are in short supply. The prison unemployment rate is high, and most prisoners are altogether idle. North Idaho costs a lot less than Green Haven, and I hope offers you and your parents more for the money. I learned that taxpayers get little from prisons except the removal of a criminal from the street, which isn't quite sufficient. What prisons claim to offer and don't is rehabilitations. I have strong opinions on crime and punishment, just as I do on welfare. I think anyone, even a minimum wage worker who envies a welfare recipient, is misguided. And anyone, even a victim of a serious crime, who believes in capital punishment isn't aware of all the facts about it, and I'll be glad to answer this matter during the question and answer period. By chance, in the state of Washington, you've got a number of prisoners from our overcrowded prisons in Washington, D.C., and they're loving one of the prisons in Washington state and hating the other. And their reasons for why they like the one and don't like the other are quite indicative of our prison problems throughout the country. From one inadequate institution, a state prison, I went to another, Creedmoor, a state hospital for the mentally ill, to write the book that became Is There No Place on Earth for Me. In April of 1978, I was at Creedmoor, learning what life inside a psychiatric center, formerly known as an insane asylum, was like. Albany had drawn up a consent form for me, a form to be signed by any patients whose records I wanted to read, granting me permission to interview them, to use their records, and to write about them with changed names. By mid-June, I was wondering if I would ever be able to use the stack of consent forms. I wanted to write about a schizophrenic patient because schizophrenia is the most common form of serious mental illness in the world. I met a goodly number of schizophrenic patients during my first couple of months at Creedmoor, but I knew that none was a suitable subject. Several were too paranoid or too fragile. They couldn't have tolerated my questions. One man was too violent. There was a danger that whoever tried to research his story might not live to write about it. On Friday, June 16, 1978, around 9 o'clock in the morning, I was standing in a Creedmoor day hall with my back against a wall. One of the first things that happens to you in a state mental institution is that someone hits you on the back. You learn that there is some safety in walls. A Creedmoor official came into the day hall and walked quickly over to me. "Your subject has arrived," she said. She had already mentioned Sylvia Frumpkin to me as a bright and articulate person and a prospective subject. Sylvia wasn't at Creedmoor when I first got there, but its longtime employees feared that she would soon be back. Shortly after midnight on June 16, 1978, Sylvia Frumpkin, who was then living in a halfway house on the Creedmoor grounds, took a bath. While splashing in the tub, she began to believe she was Laurie Lamaris, the mermaid Clark Kent had met in college and had fallen in love with in the old Superman comics. After a few minutes of frolicking, Miss Frumpkin stepped out of the tub, fell on the bathroom floor, and cut her head. The building's night supervisor drove her to the nearest hospital emergency room. On the way there, he turned on the car radio. Paul McCartney was singing a song, and Sylvia had a psychotic episode. She became convinced that he was singing to her. At the hospital, she became wild, took off her clothes, and had to be handcuffed. Within a couple of hours, she was back in Creedmoor. She was only 30 years old, and it was her 8th hospitalization there since the age of 16. On June 16th, I was introduced to Sylvia, who loved the idea of having a writer tell her story, and signed the consent form with enthusiasm. I knew immediately that I had the right subject. About 2 years later, I realized that Sylvia's misadventure in the bathtub would be the first page of my book. Sylvia was very ill in June and July, and I did little but listen to her psychotic monologues in the day hall and watch her through the window of a seclusion room where she was often put after she'd hit another patient or an attendant. In August, her condition improved, and she was allowed out on the Creedmoor grounds for brief periods. In September and October, she was allowed to go home twice a week and on special occasions. By then, I knew Sylvia's older sister and had met her parents. Mr. and Mrs. Frumkin, who are Jewish, invited me to join them for dinner on the first night of the Jewish New Year. Sylvia was about 65 pounds overweight. She was eating too much, as usual, and her mother was, as usual, exasperated by her behavior. As the dinner progressed, Mrs. Frumkin observed that she had recently seen a couple named Isidore and Gertie Finkel, the parents of a young woman named Sonia, who had often been a patient at Creedmoor on the same ward as Sylvia. Sonia Finkel had tried to commit suicide several times. Her last attempt, a year earlier, had been successful. Her father had had a heart condition and had wanted to move from New York to Arizona, but he couldn't while Sonia was alive. Shortly after Sonia's death, the Finkels moved to Arizona. Mrs. Frumkin said that when the Finkels had last been in New York, they looked gorgeous, and that since Sonia's death, Mr. Finkel's heart was fine. It's no wonder, Mrs. Frumkin went on to say, the cause of all their trouble was removed. As Sylvia reached for her fourth serving of meat, potatoes, bread, and gravy, she said, "Ma, are you trying to tell me something?" That scene, which went directly into the book, was one readers asked about. Perhaps because I write in what I like to call the third person invisible, rather than the first person singular, readers want to know how I know what was said at dinner tables. I wrote back to say I was at the dinner table, but that when Mrs. Frumkin lit into Sylvia, I wished I had been under the table. I came to Creedmoor properly introduced as a journalist. Numerous reporters have feigned mental illness and have been admitted to psychiatric institutions so they could write exposés of how bad they are. It neither surprised me that they could fool the admitting doctors into letting them in, or that they had difficulty convincing the doctors that they had come to their senses and should be given their discharges. I prefer to introduce myself forthrightly as a journalist wherever I go, and have never found that a handicap. It hasn't ever seemed to inhibit those I am with, as the Frumkins demonstrated at dinner and on many other occasions. Over a period of time at Creedmoor, new patients and staff came, patients moved from a ward to another unit, and introductions got lost in the shuffle. One evening I was with Sylvia at a quarterway house on the Creedmoor grounds. A group of women volunteers from a nearby church came to play bingo with the patients. Sylvia and I sat at a table for four. The church ladies, who had no idea who I was, hovered over me. Did I really prefer pretzels to potato chips, they asked me solicitously. Hadn't I had enough grape punch, and wouldn't I like some orange soda instead? Could they help me find out which row number 38 was in? I've never felt so patronized in my life, and I think I did experience during my 2.5 years at Creedmoor in many trivial ways how one is treated if one is deemed to be mentally ill. Thank heavens there was always Sylvia close at hand to bring me back to reality. Every time I won a prize at bingo, she snatched it away from me and said, "You don't really want that, and I could probably use it." I place more value in sharing information with readers than in simply entertaining them, though I try to make my books readable because boring books don't get read. I hope that Is There No Place on Earth for Me is useful to friends and relatives of the mentally ill and those in a position to improve their situation, as you all are here, whether you go into mental institutions as friendly visitors or in any other capacity. I try to give an idea of how bad our mental institutions are. The food is almost always inedible, and no wonder. When I was at Creedmoor, the amount of food spent per day for a patient's food was $1.80, less than New York City paid at the time to feed a police horse for a day. Sleeping conditions were terrifying. Most of the doctors were incompetent. Anyone who experienced such conditions would surely have felt as I did. Mental patients who are among the most unfortunate people on earth deserve better. As Mrs. Frumkin once observed, mental illness is worse than cancer. The suffering doesn't have an end point. In the book, I covered the alternative to institutionalization, deinstitutionalization. And in the past 10 years, the downside of that worthy policy has become increasingly apparent. A significant percentage, it's usually estimated at over 30% of the homeless are former mental patients, and while I still favor deinstitutionalization, I grieve to see patients I knew dying in the streets with all their rights on, as one civil rights lawyer put it to me. I hope you'll have some questions for me about the contents of the book, about the mismedication of the patients, of the genetic predisposition to schizophrenia, and the street life of the deinstitutionalized. My next to last book, Kate Quinton's Days, was about a woman of 80 who was almost railroaded into a nursing home, but was kept home by an innovative program that made it possible for her to realize her fondest hope, to be cared for in her home by one of her daughters with the assistance of home attendants. In my books, I try to focus on one individual. Back when I was looking for a welfare mother, Louis Steiner didn't approve of my plan. He thought it would be better to write about a number of welfare mothers. By writing about welfare mothers, about many of them, I kept telling him, I would perhaps have more facts, but no more truth. And I would lose the vividness, the felt truth one gets only when writing about a single person. I quoted a favorite professor of mine to Louis. A great figure in art is both singular and representative, which is why we keep going to see Hamlet. Perhaps to avoid any further discussions of either Shakespeare or truth, Louis came up with Mrs. Santana. Kate Quinton, though very much her own person, gave me a chance to compare life at home with home attendants to life in nursing homes. Kate Quinton had her share of home attendants who didn't work out, and finally one who did. And in the course of my research, I met many other elderly ill people confined to their homes under good and awful circumstances, and no fewer elderly ill people in nursing homes under good and awful circumstances. For those of you with any interest in geriatrics, I shall be happy to discuss questions on the problem later. While most of us here are unlikely to be on welfare, in prison, or in mental institutions, we are likely to be old. It's a lucky thing that I don't drink liquor, don't smoke, and don't use drugs, because I have another vice. I'm a print junkie. I'm addicted to reading the New York Times and the Washington Post 7 days a week, in addition to 3 weekly magazines. On January 20th, 1983, 2 months before I finished the Kate Quinton book, I serendipitously came upon a 5.5-inch long story written by a wire service that read as follows. The Army said today it had identified the remains of 22 soldiers killed in the World War II crash of a B-24 bomber in the jungles of New Guinea nearly 39 years ago. The plane and the remains of its crew and passengers were discovered in April '82 on the Pacific Island. The bomber was on a non-combat flight from the capital of Port Moresby to Nadzab when it crashed into dense jungle for unknown reasons on March 22, 1944, the Pentagon said. The remains were identified by the Army's Central Identification Lab in Hawaii as being, and then the wire service story gave the names of the 22 men who had been on the B-24. It then continued, families of all the soldiers except for Lieutenant Raymond J. Geist Jr. have been notified. The Army has asked anyone with information that could help locate Lieutenant Geist's family to notify the Army Adjutant General's Casualty Office with a collect call to such and such, and gave a phone number in Washington. A number of things about that 5.5-inch story intrigued me. How come we were missing planes in New Guinea so long after World War II was over? If the planes, this particular B-24 in the event, were being found, that suggested someone was looking for them. Who? What was this Army unit, the Central Identification Laboratory in Hawaii? I'd never heard of it. How could anyone possibly identify remains that had lain in the jungle for almost 40 years? How had the Army found the families of 21 men on the plane? And had the newspaper story led the Army to Lieutenant Geist's family? I spent the next 3 years getting these and other questions answered. The answers weren't to be found in New York, where I've done most of my work. My latest book, A Missing Plane, took me half around the world to Papua New Guinea, where I took a helicopter to a lonely mountainside in the Owen Stanley Range to see the place where the B-24 had crashed. I spent 6 weeks in Hawaii, not exactly a hardship post, I must admit, although I was too busy to spend even an hour on Waikiki. I mostly spent my time with Tadao Perui, the world's most experienced physical anthropologist, who taught me how he identified weathered remains. Furui, who died last December, was a lovely human being. In identifying the dead of our last 3 wars, I believe he performed a public service that has not been adequately recognized. The missing plane is divided into 3 parts. 1 was the recovery of the B-24, 2 was the identification of the remains by Furui, and 3 was about the pilot, the story of Robert Allred, who crashed the plane for reasons that were not unknown if you understood his character and subscribed to the belief that character has a lot to do with destiny. In subjecting the pilot's life and the lives of his relatives, Army Air Corps contemporaries, and members of his crew who hadn't been on the plane, and the lives of those aboard the plane to scrutiny, I not only had the fun of solving a mystery, but of learning what it was like to be young during the Great Depression, when getting a college was far more out of reach than it is today. And there were serious and worthy human interests in this story. For example, the delayed grief. Imagine losing a husband in 1944, eventually remarrying and resuming your life, and having his remains returned to you some 40 years later for a full-dress military funeral. It's hard on everyone, not least the second husband. I've made this talk specific, just as I do my books. I hope it will have been useful to those of you who go into journalism and those of you who don't, but who want to work in a professional or voluntary capacity with some of life's victims, whether you choose to lighten the lives of the physical or mentally ill, the victims of incest, poverty, or discrimination, or the survivors of wars. I hope you'll have lots of questions, and I'd be delighted to answer them. And thank you for being such a good audience.